Hey everyone. So just to clarify, in that story, I was offended he thought I was 14, not 15. So I'm Sonia. No, sorry, I mean Anisha. And we all girls look alike right now. So I just wanted to start by saying I'm excited to be here because not only am I a massive React Native fan, but I am a huge Formula One fan. So meeting Gunther was really special. It's also been really inspiring to meet some of the main contributors of the React community and you guys, the community that makes React what it is today. So I'm a React Native developer advocate at Amazon. And I get a lot of questions as to what is a developer advocate. And to summarize in like 2 words, it's being a developer's best friend, which means, I do have a background in React, and that's how I found myself learning React Native. So I was a developer doing React and React Native for 4 years before I found myself at Amazon. But I'm not here to talk about Amazon. I'm here to tell you a story. So once upon a time, in a land not that far away from here, there lived a very talented React Native developer named Ella. Ella was known throughout the land for this beautiful UIs she created. However, this was not enough for her evil step designer, Horner. Horner always wanted more components, and he wanted them faster and faster. Sounds like someone we know, doesn't it? So even when Ella showed Horner her components, he always wanted to see very specific edge cases and asked her to change colors at a whim. No matter how much coffee Ella drank, she couldn't keep up, because with every change in Horner's demands, she had to adjust her app, rebuild it, redeploy it. There was only one person in the world who could help Ella on her journey to making sure that Horner was not happy, and that was her trusted advisor, Ducky. So Ducky was not your ordinary rubber duck. He was a magical trusted advisor, because whenever Ella spoke to Ducky about her code-related woes, the solution would just magically appear to her. And so she started asking him, Ducky, what must I do to win over Horner and become the best developer in the world? And that's when it dawned on her, I must use Storybook. And so she began her learning. Lesson number 1, what is Storybook? Storybook is an open source front-end workshop for building, testing, and documenting components in isolation. Getting started for her was really easy, actually. You could either install the open source version of Storybook for React Native into an existing project by using the init command, which would set up the project with all the dependencies and configuration files. Or Expo's made it really easy. You can just use the project boilerplate with Storybook for React Native already configured. That sounds simple, so she started writing her first story. So to write a story, all you had to do was create this .stories file. And you could either write it in JS or TS. And that's what the TS1 would look like. The stories file is what defines all the stories for a component. And a story is what captures the rendered state of a UI component. Stories were written in component story format, or CSF, which is a way to author stories based on ES6 modules. Ella wrote her first story in CSF 3.0. And then she ran her app. Yarn runs Storybook, and she ran the Android version. When she ran her app, she noticed this add-ons tab. The add-ons tab allowed her to extend Storybook's UI and behavior. So the controls allowed her to interact with the component's arguments dynamically, like changing text, and the actions helped verify that interactions produced the correct outputs via callbacks. For instance, pressing the button would trigger the on press. And you could do some fun stuff with the background. As Ella continued her learning, she realized that the real star of the show was actually this React Native web add-on. So Storybook for React Native is built on a different architecture than Storybook for React, and it's built as a separate project. So there are going to be architectural differences. And a lot of effort is required to achieve feature parity with something that's built for the web versus for mobile, which is probably the case with a lot of React Native projects. However, Storybook for React Native supports only a small portion of the add-ons and tools and features that exist on the web version of Storybook. So this add-on helps you configure Storybook React or the Storybook web version to display React Native components using React Native for web. And it's maintained by the awesome Daniel Williams. So this means that you can use all that awesome functionality of Storybook for web on the platform of Storybook for React Native as it's released. So it works seamlessly with existing React Native libraries that utilize React Native for web already, like Paper, Reanimated by some of the awesome teams here. And you can interact with these React Native components directly in the browser. And I want to show you. So I have a very small demo here. So just a button, and just to prove that it is a React Native button, you can see that instead of an on-click, it has an on-press. So when I interact with this button, it's exactly, sorry, this is really hard, but yeah, you can see that it's like exactly as if I were reacting with it on device. What's even cooler is you can actually, if my mouse lets me go there, change the size of the screen so you can see it theoretically what it would look like on, say, a small mobile. And as promised, those React Native libraries do work as expected. So this is the paper element of a card. When you click on those buttons, it will trigger those actions, which I can't, that's the docs for it, sorry. There we go. So yeah, if you click on the button, like it would on device, as we saw on the emulator, it will still trigger those actions as if it's calling the on-press callback. So you can test out these React Native elements on web and still use all those cool features of Storybook Web. One of those is that interaction tab, and I'm going to get to that in a second. But I just wanted to show you, I've got this on my GitHub if you want to play around. But let's get back to the slides. Ooh. Cool. So Ella thought to herself, right, that looks really, really good. But everyone's favorite topic, testing. How could she make herself an even better developer by leveraging Storybook for testing? Well, actually, it was quite easy. Storybook's test runner turns all of the stories she'd already written into executable tests. And it was actually powered by Jest. So all those stories you saw, like the card, everything can be turned into tests. And what happens is that Jest will verify that the story renders without any errors. So for a story that's just, like a simple story like we saw before, it's just checking it renders without any errors. However, for ones that have interactions, like a on-click or an on-press, it can also check for errors within the play function. And check that all the assertions that you create pass. And I'm going to cover this in the next slide. So just like with Jest, you can also pass it a coverage flag and ensure that you're hitting all your coverage. Maybe not 100%, but we'll get there. What's even cooler, and I think this is really cool, is that your test can run on a deployed version of Storybook. And you can configure Test Runner to run those tests on a CI environment like with GitHub Actions, just as you would with your app. But that means all that testing cost and capacity is handled all through Storybook. And this is really the star of the show, these interaction tests. So this feature isn't available on React Native Storybook, but with web, you can run these interaction tests. So this is a really simple interaction test of clicking a button. When you simulate interactions, you get this helpful user interface on Storybook for debugging what that interaction would look like. So how do you define those interactions? So you simulate them using that play function. So where you have the play function, and the play function is a small snippet of code that runs after a story finishes rendering. So let's see how that works. So on my button, I can simulate with that interaction test that that button is clicked. But what I can also check with using Jest, I can check that when I click that button, that the login text disappears, and Ella, surname Cinder, so Cinderella, appears to be logged in. So those are, you can write your unit tests within Storybook. You can show people what those unit tests would look like, those interaction tests, and you can run them on a deployed version. You can run them locally and just make sure that you can visualize like what your unit tests might look like. So that might help make testing a little bit easier. However, didn't stop there. Ella's mission to leverage Storybook for testing led her to Chromatic. And Chromatic is this complementary tool that pairs really well with Storybook by automating those visual and interaction tests for Storybook. And it's booked by the same team. So the main way you can test with Chromatic is visual regression testing. So what Chromatic does is it takes cross-browser, pixel-perfect snapshots of your rendered code that allows you to easily see those changes. So you can keep track of the variations with your code, and you can see like how your component may vary from branch to branch, from commit to commit. So I can check from build to 13, what did my code look like? Now, you might be thinking, isn't this just snapshot testing? Well, not quite, because Jest snapshot only compares the HTML output of your rendered elements, whereas Chromatic actually captures pixel-perfect images. And another thing with Jest is it only triggers failures when there's changes in the code. But we all know that changes in code don't necessarily correlate to changes in the UI. So this is real visual regression testing. You can see how your component looked over time, from the history of when you first pushed it all the way to your latest commit, and see it side by side. So other than helping with testing and visual regression testing, Ella learned that you could also search indexed UI components so that your teammates or her teammates could discover and reuse her beautiful UI components. Every component is documented, versioned, and searchable. This is great, Ella exclaimed. I no longer have to dig through my commits when Horner asks me, what did this used to look like? And as if this wasn't beneficial enough, she could also leverage Chromatic. She could also leverage Chromatic to review the UI implementation with developers and the rest of the team. So since Storybook is automatically published to Chromatic's CDN, you can quickly share the work with your team, and within the environment, like have a conversation and make sure that when changes are pushed, they're implemented, assigned reviewers, and the changes are put through the whole environment before it gets signed off. So it's like a code review, but for UI. Phew, Ella sighed. I'm so relieved that I don't need to send Horner screenshots of my components on Slack anymore and deal with the frustration of him denying he even asked for changes during stand-up. Now every decision is in one place. A problem she often faced was that design and UI implementation would often diverge over time, causing confusion about the source of truth. But since Chromatic connects Storybook to Figma variants, it would be easy to compare the implementation with the design, speeding up that entire handoff process. So Ella was overjoyed. She's like, all my problems are going to be solved. She loved it, the team loved it, but Horner was still not convinced. And so she decided to try and list out all the benefits of Storybook. So the first one was a lower cost of testing. You don't have to render your entire app to test a single component. And that reduces testing time and resource consumption, lowering the entire cost of testing. Number two is catching edge cases. So when you create stories, you can test edge cases that may have been difficult to replicate in the app, or may have been time-consuming to replicate in the app. And that means when you are testing those edge cases and you don't have to write unit tests, it's quicker, and then you create more robust components. Teams can move at different paces and in isolation. So you can develop your front-end components in isolation of the back-end without having to rely on that back-end functionality. You don't have to wait for your back-end team to figure out what the components are going to, what the props the components are going to take in are. You can kind of build your components and change the props on the fly. Like, show them different colors, show them different arguments, interactions, and it's all in isolation of that. And this is cool for like feed-driven apps, for example. Less friction between designers and developers, and we all know that this will make most people on the team much happier. Efficiency for larger teams and library maintainers. So because you don't have to render your entire app, like library maintainers can work in isolation, and we saw the talk yesterday about how you can create a design system. So this is a perfect use case for that. You don't have to wait for, you don't have to rely on an entire team to create your design system. You can just create it, run it on Storybook, test it on Storybook, and when you have a large team, everyone can see what work is going on. And finally, rapid prototyping. So say you need to just spin up a component and show someone what you're doing. You could write a story that would demonstrate what that may look like and pull up a prototype, even simulate like an entire user flow by creating those interaction tests from component to component. So, the bad. Horner rebooted. He's like, that sounds fine, but what about the fact that there is no parity between the web version and the native version? So since Storybook and React depends on a different version of the native version, it's going to be difficult to maintain parity between those two versions. There's initial overhead, so setting up Storybook and integrating it with an existing project does require that upfront effort. We're testing on web, we're not testing on a device. So there is going to be differences in behavior, in appearance compared to what it may look like on web and what it may look like on the device or an emulator. And one of the main things I think if you've implemented Storybook for native, you'll find is that repo management is difficult for the native version because you have to set your app's you have to set Storybook in your app to have the entry point of app. So you can't render your app, you have to render Storybook to get it running in the emulator. All hope was not lost, however, because Ella had a couple of solutions up her sleeve. So, for maintaining parity with the web version, it wasn't a solution, but she did say that you can use all the latest and greatest features. So those interaction tests that aren't available right now on React Native are available in the web version of Storybook using the web add-on. Yes, while there may be initial overhead, good things always come to those who wait. When we're testing on web and we're not testing on a device, this is a common question that you always get. Like, fine, I'm running Storybook on my web version. How is it going to mimic what I would actually see on device? So one of the solutions I think is really unique is you can still run all those suite of testing tools like Maestro, but you can run them on your device versus on the web. So what I mean by this is you can run your version of Storybook, you can write all your Maestro tests, and then run them on the device if you're worried that you're only testing on device and not web. So you still get those benefits of the lower cost of testing, the fact that you don't have to run your entire app to run those interaction tests. And overall, it's quicker, right? And we all want to just make testing easier, so that is a good option. And finally, repo management. So Sandra talked a little bit about micro front ends, and one of the ways you can implement that is by using TurboRepo to isolate Storybook. And there's actually two really good solutions I've seen, and one is by Mo Javed from Tiro, one of the agencies, and he did a really cool talk at one of the meetups, and it was called Sunrising React Native, and what you can see is his folder structure here, where the repos are separated. So you've got your main repo, but you've got your Storybook as its own app, which means that whole issue of having your app have an entry point, you can still have that in main, but you can have your Storybook kind of running as a separate app. And another one was actually by Daniel Williamson himself, who showed an example of running React Native and React Native Storybook together, so you can have your emulator running and your web version running. So for all the problems, there are solutions, and I think it's a great tool. And so did Ella, and so did Horner. And he was finally convinced, and he decided to embark on this fun journey with Ella to use Storybook and Chromatic as their loyal sidekicks, and they lived happily ever after. The end.